At a time of heightened political tensions nationwide, the role of state attorneys general has been put on full display.
So we challenged the constitutionality of the President Trump's executive order.
Oregon has a new attorney general in more than a decade as former House Speaker Dan Rayfield steps into the role as Oregon's 18th top lawyer, how he plans to address some of the most pressing issues from voters.
I'd like to create a working families unit that focuses on that value.
To taking on the Trump administration's political agenda, including threats of federal funding cuts and birthright citizenship.
I believe that this right that is enshrined in the 14th Amendment was so darn clear that you wouldn't have done this.
And how Oregon's top prosecutor plans to navigate his new role while also focusing on the issues facing Oregonians. Right now on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. Today we are speaking to the newly elected Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield, who is stepping into office to lead the state's Department of Justice. The DOJ oversees about 1,300 people and has a biennial budget of about $500 million. Now, before moving into politics, Rayfield spent 18 years in private practice working on consumer protection cases. He then served in Oregon's House of Representatives for several years and became co-chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, then serving as Speaker of the House. Most recently, Rayfield was sworn in as Attorney General on the very last day of 2024. Mr. Rayfield, thanks so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, I want to make a quick note before we get into our interview that we are taping this on Wednesday afternoon, so things may change throughout the week. So just wanted to make that note as we have some very timely things to talk about. So first, you came into office a little under 2 months ago, as we mentioned, and you've been very busy. Since President Trump took office a month ago, you've joined or filed 6 multi-state lawsuits against the administration. So I want to ask you first, did you anticipate this much litigation so soon?
Okay, and the first thing I would say is, while I've certainly been busy, everybody working the Department of Justice here in Oregon has been incredibly busy working on behalf of all Oregonians. And so while I'm here, just know there's like an incredible team that is behind us. And I don't think anybody at the Department of Justice, myself included, would have thought that by a month into the Trump presidency, we would have 6 lawsuits filed. Of course, when you go through a presidential campaign for more than 2 years, you have presidential candidates that talk about a lot of things they want to do. We knew that some of the things that the president wanted to do and talk about were unconstitutional. I just don't think we thought it would happen as quickly as it did.
Yeah, you actually, off camera before the show, you were talking to us about just how quickly those orders were coming through, and you were online just watching them, your team, as they came through. I want to ask you, of those 6 multi-state lawsuits, 5 are in direct response to presidential executive orders, the 6th in response to Elon Musk's executive power, what you call unlawful power. But how are you deciding which actions to maybe join or pursue at this point? There are a lot that are coming through.
We have an incredible team of people across the nation and Democratic attorneys general that are monitoring what's going on. And then what we really look internally within Oregon is what is the impact to Oregonians? And have Oregonians been harmed? If that is the case, we need to look at is there a violation? Did the president overstep his bounds of authority? And the thing is, when you're elected president, you have a ton of powers. The one thing you don't get to do is you don't get to violate the Constitution. You don't get to violate federal statutes or the Administrative Procedures Act. And if those 2 things are there, and we believe we have a valid claim, we file a lawsuit on behalf of Oregonians to protect their values and their interests.
Do you have a team dedicated to just strictly watching all the orders as they come through and then evaluating if, as you say, if it's worth something that you should pursue?
It's multiple fold. So we have attorney generals across the nation where we are all working very closely daily, and our teams within our agencies are working daily to monitor what's going on. And they're talking directly with the state agencies and the impact of whether it's a school district, a university, healthcare. We've got our pulse there. We also set up a federal accountability and oversight committee that is made up of healthcare officials, education, law enforcement, a broad swath of individuals that have a pulse on what's going on in their communities, which gives us an opportunity to communicate out, but then also hear, so that we can be as responsive as we can be in the moment, because things are moving incredibly quick.
And as you're saying there, we have seen several of Trump's executive orders paused by federal court judges. That includes the federal funding freeze, along with an end to birthright citizenship and NIH funding, among others. But there is a concern that Trump disregards the rulings of these judges. On Tuesday, for example, we saw President Trump sign another executive order that seeks to bring independent federal agencies under his control and effectively states that his office would have the final say in interpreting the laws in those agencies. In addition, we heard from Vice President J.D. Vance on Twitter saying in part, quote, "If a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the Attorney General in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power," end quote. Now, some people interpret this suggesting that the executive branch could refuse to comply with these court orders, essentially ignoring the ruling. So first, I want to start with that. With President Trump's order yesterday about the president and the attorney general, overseeing those independent agencies' laws. What are your thoughts on that? What's your interpretation around those orders in particular?
Yeah, this goes back to high school government, truly. When Congress creates an independent agency, it was done for a reason. The president of the United States, in their power, does not get to just come in and override an action of Congress. There's separation of powers for a reason. These are valid conversations that he may want to have. And if he wants to have a conversation, then he needs to do it in the appropriate place. Anytime the president steps over the bounds of their authority, whether it's the Constitution or federal law, that's where you have folks coming in and enforcing those rules of law. And right now, it really feels the president is just pushing the envelope and testing the waters, much like I have a 13-year-old, and much like he did when he was a toddler.
What do you think would be the result of this order that we saw yesterday? I mean, could we see something come out of this? In real terms, I guess.
We'll wait to see. So there's time involved to really kind of see what actually happens. The one thing that I note for a lot of folks, there was a ton of executive orders that came out on day one. A lot of them didn't do anything in the moment. They asked for various agencies to report back, and there was a little bit of a delay. What we have seen is when some of the first executive orders have been released, there have been clarifications which take significant backtracks. And so that's what we want to wait to see, what happens with this specific executive order, to really know exactly where things are headed. The one thing that I will say, we have had some concerns about whether the president would follow various judicial orders, but what we have seen, and we've filed some enforcement orders, or at least one, and in all of the cases so far, what has come out of the mouth of the federal administration is that they are complying. Obviously, we're still waiting to see. There's a long time, as these cases will take a little while to wind through the courts.
What happens if they decide not to follow those rulings? What then?
Yeah, there are various enforcement actions that you can take within a court to compel action under those various scenarios. But again, I would go back, and I feel very optimistic when it comes to our democracy. And right now, the federal administration is following the orders of the court.
Can you talk more about that? That you're saying you feel optimistic about our democracy right now. Can you speak more about that?
You have people that step into judicial roles that come from different political persuasions in this world. I think that when most people put on that robe, they do their absolute best to really be independent and follow the rule of law. We have attorneys general across this nation that are holding the Trump administration accountable every single time they try and violate the Constitution. And so far, our judges and our judicial system have been there as a backstop against those unconstitutional actions.
If you look back to President Trump's first term, we saw the AG's office under Ellen Rosenblum filing or joining about 17 lawsuits against his administration. So under your direction, we're seeing a much steeper rate, 6 so far in just a matter of weeks. What kind of impact is this having on other priorities in your office?
Yeah, one of the things that I say is that this is incredibly important. When I ran for this office, we said protecting the values of Oregonians was one of the reasons to have a Democratic Attorney General in office as a backstop against federal overreach. It is an essential responsibility of this office that has only grown throughout the past decade. That does not mean you cannot focus on the other important reasons that I ran for this office. Seniors, consumers, kids, folks that are paying monthly bills rely on an Attorney General that that is going to look out for them, working families when it comes to wage theft, consumer prices. That work has to continue going on in the same vein, as well as people rely on us to keep our communities safe. And so this is an area where we are continuing to just work and be as creative as we possibly can without diminishing the other incredible work on behalf of Oregonians in other areas.
So this work essentially with all of the orders and the lawsuits isn't taking away from anything else right now?
No, at the very beginning, that's why I said when you wanted to credit me with all of the work that I'm doing, what I can tell you is the people at the Department of Justice are working overtime because we are bought in as an agency to stop the oversight, but at the same time, you just cannot quit the work that you're doing on the day-to-day basis to keep communities safe and look out for consumers.
Okay. Well, we are seeing a lot of talk on the local level here in Portland and across the state about sanctuary laws. We're also seeing the Trump administration speak out about pulling funding for jurisdictions that support sanctuary laws. He's even going as far as threatening to punish some law enforcement that don't cooperate with immigration enforcement. So how will your office play a role, and have you taken any steps so far in protecting people in Oregon in sanctuary areas from ICE?
One of the things that we're really trying to do is kind of clarify what the sanctuary laws in Oregon are and what do they mean, because I think there's a lot of misperceptions. The first thing to know is that our sanctuary laws have been in place for more than 7 different presidential administrations, and we have had no problems with them in the past. What it really boils down to is that we're not going to use state resources to basically implement federal law, the federal immigration law. That is a federal responsibility. Federal agents are supposed to do that. And in that vein, you wouldn't want the federal government coming in and saying, we want our local law enforcement to not do local law enforcement things, burglary, murder, traffic tickets. We want them focused on what we're paying our local dollars for and not being commandeered to go on to other issues. That's the basis for it. Obviously, the Trump administration is really working hard to utilize creatively their federal resources to implement their immigration aims. We're making sure that our state resources are going for the highest and best purpose and focused on the things that we see going on here in Oregon: housing, homelessness, making sure we're improving public safety. And so that's kind of the way we're seeing those separation of powers.
Have you done anything different in your office since we saw these, just reforms basically from the federal government around immigration? Have you done anything locally or at the state level?
What we have seen within the agency is an influx of response or phone calls into our office asking questions, trying to understand what those roles are within various communities. Information for our education partners, information within healthcare. These are really important areas where people need to understand what the law is, as opposed to just reacting to the political bluster that they see coming out of Washington, D.C. right now.
As Attorney General, you represent all Oregonians, right? Not just your party. And recently a bill was introduced in the House by Republicans which would modify the state sanctuary law that we're speaking of. It would allow law enforcement agencies in Oregon to work with federal authorities to identify and remove individuals convicted of violent felonies, Class A misdemeanors, and felony sexual offenses. Minority Leader in the House, Christine Drazen, said, quote, Oregon's sanctuary state law is extreme and out of touch with the vast majority of Oregonians who want to live in safe neighborhoods. A statewide poll commissioned by House Republicans ahead of the 2025 legislative session found 69% of Oregonians support deporting undocumented immigrants who have been convicted of a crime while in the U.S. So do you think that the state and cities should protect undocumented citizens, or undocumented people who have committed these violent crimes?
Yeah, and I haven't had an opportunity to read that bill or exactly look at that. I always try and stay within my lane. The legislators where I was just there a couple of years ago, they don't want me coming into their business right now, although we have some pretty important things we'll be working on. When it comes to immigration, I think the one thing that I always think about, especially when it's people who have been committing violent crimes, and it doesn't matter what your status is, we want our communities to be safe, and that law enforcement should have the tools that they need to be able to get criminals off of our streets and into jail. There is is a policy conversation, and I'm assuming that's what they're trying to have, is when someone commits a crime, do they want that person to be in a jail here within Oregon, or do they want to deport them first to another country? The real policy conversation that's going on right now is that some people, and again, this is a legislative conversation, would like those folks to remain in an Oregon prison, primarily because if they get deported back to their country of origin, they may not stay in that prison, and we're not really accomplishing that underlying goal, which is community safety. And so I don't know what the status of those conversations are in the legislature, but I think it's the best way to outline kind of the viewpoints that I've heard.
Okay, and then your stance is that you would follow whatever law the legislature puts forward into law,
Absolutely.
essentially, as opposed to giving your opinion on whether you think, I mean, as far as whether you think that, where we should land on this?
Yeah, I believe that anybody who has committed a crime should be held accountable in that stance. The conversation about where they should be held accountable, I think, is a very important one, and we'll wait to see what the legislature does.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the public defender crisis, to where Measure 114 stands. We will get Attorney General Rayfield's take on some of the most pressing issues affecting people right here in Oregon. Stay with us. And welcome back to Straight Talk. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our conversation with Oregon's new Attorney General, Dan Rayfield. Thanks so much for being here today.
Absolutely.
Okay, we were talking a lot about some of the national actions we've seen and Oregon's response, but I want to talk about, of course, you're coming into this role, you're coming into your third month on the job soon, and what are your top priorities that you want to tackle right now?
And it really kind of goes back to the things we talk about in the campaign. I think a campaign is incredibly important where you're out in the community talking to people about what they want their Department of Justice to look like. And so I want to expand on that. And so we talked a lot about the first tenet, which is really holding the federal administration accountable when they have overreach and it's impacting Oregonians. Then there's this other big chunk, which is really working on behalf of working families, seniors, and consumers, and expanding the work that we do. These are the things that we take for granted. Right? When you walk into the supermarket and you're paying the price for a given product, that's because we have strong antitrust laws that have been supported throughout the years by Democrats and Republicans. It's about enforcement of that. That also ties into what's going on in the federal government as well right now. As you see the Trump administration gutting the top consumer protection agency, states' roles are going to need to increase in these areas. And that's the background. That's what I've done for 18 years of my life. That's what I'm bringing into this. And I really want to build on the work and expand our work to protect seniors, working families, and think about all the other things. It's your prices that you pay at the pump. It is wage theft. It is misclassification of workers. A whole host of things that are going on. People taking advantage in terms of scams. And then there's the other side of that is people really want a Department of Justice that works to keep them safe in their community. And I want to build on the work within the Department of Justice to do that, partnering with local law enforcement as well as our district attorneys to be a partner to help convene and coordinate on the bigger issues we're seeing, whether that's human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug cartels, or retail theft. Really bigger issues going on in the state that we can help and lend some value to.
And something related to that, we've covered a lot on the public defender crisis here in Oregon. We have a major issue with ensuring that everyone who is accused of a crime in our state has a defense attorney to represent them in court. That doesn't always happen. You've spoken about this when you were House Speaker, but now as Attorney General, how can you help tackle this major hurdle that Oregon faces when it comes to our justice system?
It's about being a partner at the table. So one thing that people should really know is over the past 6 years, we've almost more than doubled the budget for our public defenders. And the way that it impacts us and our communities, right? People need to have public defenders, and that helps keep our communities safe, right, when people have representation. It also is what we need to do constitutionally. So we have kind of this dual value set of why we need to do that. We've increased the budget. There are current conversations going on in the legislature. One of the last things that I did in the Oregon legislature was we moved the responsibility or the agency over to the executive branch so that the governor could have more oversight into this process. And so we're in the middle of this transition where we've put some additional resources into it, we've moved it into the executive branch, and now there's some difficult conversations are going to start to occur within the commission and then also within the legislature as they look for solutions. What I would say is that it's very easy to say dumping more money onto a problem is going to solve something like that, and I think it could help, but it's not the only thing that needs to occur, and you've got good people at the table in the legislature and the governor's office working on it.
So you're saying also changing that system, not only giving money to the system, but essentially changing it a little bit as well?
We need to reevaluate it. We need to be looking at efficient use of our taxpayer dollars and making sure we're getting the outcomes that we desire. And right now, if you look at what we pay on a per capita basis, Oregon pays a higher per capita basis on for our public defenders than, say, many other states that have better outcomes. We need to ask the question why, and then we should start solution finding in that. Because this has been moved into the executive branch, it's not directly under the purview of the Attorney General, but you are an incredible partner, because a lot of the problems we see because of a lack of representation result in lawsuits that we, as the Attorney General's office, have to then defend those lawsuits because we are the attorneys for the state. So we do have a vested interest in this.
Yeah, indirectly very involved, actually. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about a voter-approved measure to tighten gun laws in Oregon, Measure 114. Now, this law would add requirements for purchasing a gun and would limit the number of rounds in a magazine. It was passed by voters in 2022. It's currently in the courts after being challenged. What's the status on this, and do you think it will survive all the court challenges?
Yeah, I do feel optimistic about its court challenges. And one of the things, just for viewers to know, is when the voters passed ballot measure 114, it was challenged in the courts. The Department of Justice, being the attorneys for the state, was the ones to defend the voters' will and intent by passing that in the courts. Our administration will continue defending that law in the courts to make sure that it is passed and enacted in the law. I think, I am 45, my son is 13. When I went through high school, I didn't know a world like we have today. And my son has only been in an environment where gun violence is commonplace. And these are some of the first steps that we need to take to start moving away from that.
Do you know why it's stuck after a Harney County judge, right, was the last of movement? Do we know where it is exactly and kind of why it's stuck there?
So the Harney County judge ruled, and it's currently on appeal right now. Okay. And so you're just moving through the legal processes as we go through the courts.
Okay. One of the priorities of Ellen Rosenblum, your predecessor, was stopping elder abuse. So by year 2030, it's estimated that about 20% of Oregon's population will be 65 and older. We know that older Americans seem to be disproportionately impacted by scammers. How is your office handling this as we continue to see technology advance, these scams become more sophisticated, and consumers fall for them?
So I look at it on a spectrum, first off. A lot of the abuse that comes in, we want to stop it before it happens. Right? And some of these can come from family members. Some of these can happen on folks that are overseas, right? And some of them are traveling from state to state. There's a lot of different ways that elder abuse can happen. So on the front end, there's education and prevention. That is the best way that you can stop that. I believe in Oregon we can do better at that. And that's something long term that in the Department of Justice, being a nexus or the center of a hub of information, I think we can better communicate with folks and educate on the front end. Then there is the next part, which is accountability. And that is in working in that space to make sure that you have the resources to be able to move forward in some of these spaces. And it's challenging from time to time. And so I think we need to work to expand our efforts in that space to be better partners. A lot of elder abuse is also done at the county level. And it'll be done through your criminal prosecutions in those spaces. And then on the back end, there's going to be some cases where if it is, if it's an international scam or other things where we're unable to hold accountable and prevention on the front end, education has not worked. I think we as a society have to find a better way to take care of those people who've experienced losses. And it can be, for someone on a fixed income, $500 can mean the absolute world to them. And sometimes people are stuck out after a very challenging situation that ultimately could happen to any of us at some point.
And sometimes it's when they're already past, they're in retirement and that is their, kind of their nest egg that they've relied on for so long. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to touch on. We only have about 30 seconds, but are there other priorities that we saw from your predecessor that you're continuing to pursue?
There is a lot that is done at the Department of Justice, things that a lot of people don't even think about, whether it's child support, right? This is an incredible function for families here in this state, and the Department of Justice plays a significant role administering that program for most of our counties here in this state. We will continue to work on our bigger consumer protection cases, so a whole host of things that we're excited to keep working on in that space.
Okay, Oregon's new Attorney General Dan Rayfield, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for watching. Coming up next week on Straight Talk, we are talking the economic health of Oregon's biggest city. A new report shows where our area is growing and where there's still work that needs to be done. That's next week on Straight Talk.